3 days before my grandson's graduation, Tyler burst into my garage holding his phone so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Grandpa," he said, barely catching his breath, "I think somebody's selling your bronze achievement medal." I wiped my hands on an old shop rag and looked at the screen. The Pawnshop listing showed a medal I recognized instantly. The tiny serial engraving near the ribbon mount was unmistakably mine. The shop sat nearly 800 miles away, yet my locked metal cabinet had been opened only 4 days earlier. One impossible question settled over the garage. Who had sold a piece of my military life? If you've ever discovered that the people we trust most sometimes carry the heaviest hidden burdens, stay with me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Tyler zoomed in on the photograph. "You really think it's yours?" "I know it is." "How?" I pointed to the tiny scratch beside the engraved number. "I dropped it onto a concrete floor the day I brought it home." He looked again. "I never would have noticed that." Mechanics notice little things. 40 years repairing National Guard trucks had trained my eyes to remember details most people overlooked. Sometimes that was a blessing. Sometimes it wasn't. I walked into the house and unlocked the walnut cabinet where I kept the medals I planned to leave Tyler one day. The shelves were empty. Every medal, every ribbon, every citation. Gone. My daughter-in-law Melissa came into the room carrying folded graduation announcements. "What happened?" "My medals." She looked toward the cabinet. "Maybe you moved them." "I don't think so." "You've been reorganizing the garage." "Technically possible. Emotionally wrong." I simply nodded. "I'll keep looking." She seemed relieved. Too relieved. That evening, Tyler helped me search every drawer, toolbox, and storage cabinet on the property. Neither of us expected to find anything. We were searching because hope sometimes needs something to do. As the sun disappeared behind the barn, Tyler sat beside my old workbench. "I always thought those medals would stay here." "So did I." He hesitated. "You promised to tell me the stories behind them after graduation." "I still intend to." I smiled, though it felt heavier than usual. Before bed, I unlocked the cabinet once more. Empty. Only one thing remained inside. A folded maintenance receipt. 6 days earlier, I had removed the cabinet doors to replace a worn hinge. The repair invoice listed the exact afternoon the cabinet stood open in my garage while I drove into town for replacement hardware. I stared at the date. That simple receipt suddenly mattered far more than the missing hinge. The next morning, Melissa casually asked whether I had remembered where I put the medals. "I haven't. I'm sure they'll turn up. I hope you're right." She smiled, then quickly looked away. Years earlier, one of my National Guard sergeants taught me something I've never forgotten. When someone wants you to stop asking questions, they'll often offer reassurance before they offer help. I quietly folded the repair receipt and slipped it into my wallet. For the first time, I wasn't trying to remember where my medals had gone. I was trying to understand who knew the cabinet had been standing open that afternoon. The repair receipt stayed folded inside my wallet all through the next day. Most people would have focused on the missing medals. I kept thinking about the cabinet hinge. During my years repairing National Guard vehicles, I learned that breakdowns rarely began where they finally appeared. The loose bolt everyone noticed often started with a worn bearing no one bothered to inspect. My metals had disappeared, but the hinge told me when opportunity first arrived. I drove to the hardware store where I'd bought the replacement parts. The cashier recognized me immediately. "Mr. Lawson, how's that old cabinet working?" "Better than before." She smiled. "You were gone about an hour that afternoon." I was. 1 hour. Just enough time. Not enough for a stranger to wander into my garage unnoticed. Family, however, came and went almost every weekend. When I returned home, Tyler was already waiting beside my workbench. I found something else. He handed me a printed copy of the Pawnshop listing. I called them. "You did?" "I only asked whether the metal was still available." "What did they say?" "They said another shipment had arrived with several military collectibles." Several, not one. If my bronze achievement medal had traveled there, the others probably had too. Melissa walked into the garage carrying lemonade. "You boys still looking?" Tyler nodded. "Grandpa's medal is definitely at that pawn shop." Melissa forced a smile. "Pictures online can be misleading." I watched her carefully. She never looked at the photograph. Only at me. "I suppose they can," I answered. She relaxed slightly. Again, reassurance arrived before curiosity. That pattern kept repeating. Later that afternoon, I unlocked the cabinet one more time. The shelves remained empty except for dust outlines where the display boxes had rested for years. One outline looked different. The rectangular wooden support beneath the largest metal case had been moved recently. I lifted it carefully. Nothing underneath. Just a faint impression where someone had removed the case before sliding the support back into place. Deliberately. That evening, I opened an old maintenance notebook I had kept since retirement. Whenever I repaired anything valuable around the house, I recorded dates, parts, and receipts. Tyler used to tease me. "You write down everything." I forget enough already. Flipping through the pages, I found the cabinet repair entry. Then another note I'd almost overlooked. Melissa stopped by with graduation invitations while cabinet doors were removed. I'd written it simply because she admired the new brass hinges. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it established something important. She knew the medals weren't locked away that afternoon. I quietly closed the notebook before Tyler came back into the room. He didn't need suspicion. Not yet. The next morning, my son David called from a business trip. "Dad, Melissa says you're worried about those medals." "I'll find them." "You probably tucked them somewhere safe." "Maybe." He sounded relieved. "I knew you'd figure it out." After hanging up, I spread 3 items across my workbench. The Pawnshop listing. The cabinet repair receipt. My maintenance notebook. The dates almost fit, except for one detail. The Pawnshop listing showed the metal had been photographed 2 days before I even repaired the cabinet, which meant the metal hadn't simply traveled after it disappeared. It had already been shipped before anyone realized it was go. The impossible timeline stayed with me all night. If the pawnshop photographed my metal 2 days before I repaired the cabinet, then I had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. During 32 years as a National Guard mechanic, I learned that when the repair date doesn't match the failure date, the machine isn't lying. The diagnosis is. Somewhere between my garage and that pawnshop, another timeline existed, and I intended to find it. The next morning, I did something that surprised everyone. I stopped looking for the medals. At least, that's what I wanted my family to believe. Melissa found me rebuilding the carburetor on Tyler's old pickup. "I thought you were still searching." I shrugged. "Maybe I remembered the dates wrong." She smiled with visible relief. "I've done that before." "So have I." For the first time since the medals disappeared, she stopped watching me. Exactly what I hoped would happen. Tyler looked confused after she walked away. "You've given up?" "No." "Then why say that?" I tightened one more bolt before answering. "Sometimes people tell you more after they think you've stopped listening." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand. I hope you won't have to." That afternoon, I drove to Bennett Freight Services on the edge of town. Ruth Bennett had managed regional shipping operations for almost 30 years before retiring. We had served together on several veterans' charity projects. She recognized me before I reached the counter. "Earl Lawson. It's been too long." It has. After a few minutes of catching up, I showed her the printed Pawnshop listing. "I'm trying to understand how something traveled this far." She studied the shipping label visible in the online photograph. "You don't need the tracking number." "I don't?" She pointed toward a small barcode format printed beneath the address. "That routing code belongs to a commercial collateral processor." "Collateral?" "Items pledged for secured loans often move through companies like this before reaching wholesalers or pawn distributors." The word struck me harder than I expected. Collateral. Not stolen property. Not random resale. Collateral. Ruth continued. "If that's correct, somebody probably signed paperwork before this metal ever left the state." The drive home felt much longer. Collateral meant planning. Planning meant documentation. Documentation meant evidence. That evening, I quietly opened the family photo albums stored in my workshop. Most contained birthdays, fishing trips, and Tyler's baseball games. One photograph stopped me cold. It had been taken 8 years earlier during a National Guard family appreciation picnic. I stood beside Tyler, who couldn't have been more than 10. Pinned to my work shirt was the Bronze Achievement Medal. Behind us stood Melissa. She was smiling toward the camera, but her eyes weren't on us. They were fixed on the medals. On the back of the photograph, my late wife had written only one sentence. "Someday, these belong to Tyler." I slipped the picture beside the repair receipt inside my wallet. One reminded me when the cabinet stood open. The other reminded me why the medals mattered. The next morning, Ruth called. "I kept thinking about your medal, and I searched one old logistics directory." She paused. "The collateral processor listed on that shipping code closed 2 years ago. So, their archived records were transferred to one private appraisal company." I wrote down the company's name. Then Ruth quietly added one final sentence. "Earl, that company specialized in evaluating military collectibles." The mystery was no longer about a missing cabinet. It had become a question of who valued my medals highly enough to turn them into paperwork long before they ever reached the pawnshop. The word collateral stayed with me the entire drive home. I had spent decades believing my medals represented service. Now I had evidence suggesting someone else viewed them as financial assets. During my years maintaining National Guard vehicles, I learned that every machine eventually revealed the reason it failed, not through noise, through the pattern hidden underneath it. families weren't much different. The next morning, I drove to the appraisal company Ruth had identified. The business occupied a modest brick office beside an industrial warehouse. Inside, an elderly receptionist greeted me warmly. "I'm looking for information about an old military appraisal." She smiled apologetically. "We no longer perform those evaluations." "I understand. But we retained archived client indexes." That sounded promising. I handed her the printed pawnshop photograph. She studied the metal carefully. "I remember these." "You do?" "For several years, we evaluated military collections for secured lenders." Exactly what Ruth suspected. The receptionist disappeared into the archive room before returning with a worn appointment ledger. She traced one finger down a page dated almost 5 months earlier. There was an appraisal under the Lawson name. My stomach tightened. "Earl Lawson." She looked closer. "No." She turned the book toward me. The handwritten entry read, "Melissa Lawson." No explanation. Only a client name, a scheduled appointment, and one notation beside it. "Private loan documentation requested." I thanked her and left without asking another question. Outside, I sat inside my truck for several minutes, staring at the dashboard. The investigation had finally stopped pointing toward strangers. It had quietly circled back home. That afternoon, Tyler stopped by the garage carrying graduation invitations. "You look tired." "I've been thinking." "About the medals? About promises?" He smiled. "You always said machines don't lie." "They don't." "What about people?" I hesitated. "They usually don't start by lying. They start by hoping they won't have to tell the whole truth." He nodded slowly. "I think that's worse." "So do I." I never mentioned Melissa's name. Not yet. Graduation remained only 2 days away. Tyler deserved to walk across that stage carrying hope instead of suspicion. Late that evening, my son David finally returned from his business trip. He found me sitting beside the empty metal cabinet. "I heard Tyler found one online." "He did." David rubbed the back of his neck. "Melissa feels awful that she suggested you misplaced them." "I'm sure she does." He looked relieved by my calm response. "She's had a difficult few months." "Business?" He froze for just a moment. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess." Not entirely. His reaction answered more than his words. After he went inside, I unfolded the appraisal company's business card. Written on the back was one additional reference number the receptionist had copied from the archive. She hadn't explained it. She didn't need to. The number belonged to the lending company that requested the appraisal. The next morning, Ruth called again. "I checked one more thing." "What did you find?" "The lender still uses the same document processor." "So?" "They archive shipping authorizations." I wrote down the contact information. Then Ruth asked one quiet question. "Earl, if the paperwork confirms what we're both beginning to suspect, I won't ruin Tyler's graduation, even if it meant carrying the truth alone for another 48 hours." I folded the appraisal reference beside the cabinet repair receipt and the old National Guard family photograph. 3 unrelated papers, 3 different years. Yet together, they now pointed toward one painful possibility. The medals hadn't been stolen because they were valuable. They had been professionally valued because someone desperately needed them to become collateral before a private loan came due on graduation week. 2 days remained before Tyler's graduation. The calendar on my workshop wall suddenly felt louder than every question I hadn't asked. During my years keeping National Guard vehicles ready for deployment, deadlines never frightened me. Hidden problems did. A truck could always be repaired if you knew what was broken. Families were harder. Sometimes everyone kept working while pretending nothing important had failed. I called the document processor Ruth had identified. After several transfers, a courteous representative finally answered. "I'm trying to verify ownership records for military collectibles. I'm afraid we can't discuss client information." "I understand." I gave her the appraisal reference number copied from the archive. Silence. Then the sound of computer keys. "I can confirm one thing." I waited. The appraisal supported a secured personal loan. No surprise. The pledged items were released for liquidation after the borrower defaulted. My stomach tightened. Were the items shipped directly to the pawnshop? No. They were transferred through a regional liquidation warehouse before distribution. Another piece quietly slid into place. Nothing about the process suggested burglary. Everything suggested paperwork. When the call ended, I wrote one sentence across the top of my notebook. Desperation follows procedure long before anyone notices the consequences. That afternoon, I drove past Melissa's boutique. The front windows were covered with brown paper. A handwritten sign read, "Temporarily closed." I parked across the street without getting out. Several months earlier, that shop had been filled with customers buying handmade gifts and seasonal decorations. Now it stood completely empty. For the first time since this investigation began, anger gave way to something else. Sadness. Business failures rarely happen overnight. Neither do impossible decisions. Back home, Tyler was polishing the old pickup we had restored together. "You've been quiet." "I've been thinking. About graduation. About promises." He smiled. "I still can't wait to hear the medal stories." "You will. I promise." Those words hurt more than he realized. I intended to keep that promise, no matter what happened next. Later that evening, David found me alone in the garage. "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Melissa says you've been making phone calls." "I have." He looked exhausted. "Please don't make graduation harder than it already is." Interesting. He never asked whether I had found the medals, only whether I would stop looking. "I won't embarrass Tyler." His shoulders relaxed. "Thank you." After he left, I opened the old walnut cabinet again. Empty. Except for one forgotten envelope tucked behind the lower shelf. Inside rested the original insurance inventory I completed years earlier. Every medal. Every serial number. Every presentation date. Each one signed by me. At the bottom appeared another document I had completely forgotten. A professional ownership verification completed after a Veterans Museum exhibition nearly 12 years earlier. The verification included detailed photographs, serial engravings, ribbon stitching, even the tiny scratch beside the Bronze Achievement Medal. Those records proved ownership beyond any reasonable question. The medals weren't just sentimental keepsakes anymore. They were fully documented property. Just before sunset, Ruth called again. "I found something." "What?" "The lender processed one final document before liquidation." "What kind?" "A loan extension request." I remained silent. The request was denied. Who signed it? Ruth hesitated. It wasn't Melissa. My grip tightened around the phone. It was your son, David. For several long moments I couldn't speak. The business failure had belonged to Melissa. But the final attempt to save the medals had belonged to David. The truth had become far more complicated than betrayal. It had become a family desperately trying and failing to outrun a mistake before Tyler's graduation. 48 hours before graduation, I stopped asking who had taken my medals. I already knew enough to understand something more important. My family hadn't been hiding greed. They had been hiding fear. During my years maintaining National Guard trucks, I often reminded younger mechanics that the final inspection mattered more than the first diagnosis. Anyone could point at a broken engine. Real experience meant proving exactly why it failed before replacing a single part. Families deserved the same patience. I laid every document across my workshop bench: the cabinet repair receipt, the National Guard Museum ownership verification, the appraisal reference, the pawnshop listing, the family photograph, David's denied loan extension. One by one, they stopped looking like separate papers. They became one uninterrupted timeline. Just after sunrise, Ruth Bennett arrived carrying a sealed envelope. I finally received the archived shipping authorization. I carefully opened it. Inside rested copies of every transfer document connected to the liquidation company. The first page listed the appraisal number. The second listed the shipping warehouse. The third contained something I had hoped to find: owner verification. Attached to the loan paperwork was a photocopy of my old museum ownership certificate. Not the original. A copy. Someone had duplicated my documentation years earlier. That explained everything. The medals had never been anonymously valued. They had been submitted with paperwork proving they belonged to me. Only one signature remained. Borrower, Melissa Lawson. Another signature appeared beneath it. Co-signer, David Lawson. I closed the folder quietly, not because I wanted to ignore the truth, because I finally understood its shape. Melissa had borrowed the money. David had tried to save her. Neither had planned to lose the medals forever. Desperation had simply outrun repayment. That afternoon, I drove to the liquidation warehouse. The manager met me in a modest office lined with shipping cartons and inventory shelves. He reviewed every ownership document without interruption. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Lawson. Yes? You've brought far more documentation than most people. I've had practice. He smiled faintly. The ownership records are excellent. So the medals can come home? He hesitated. Not all of them. My heart sank. The Bronze Achievement Medal is still in inventory. The others? Already transferred. I looked down. Sold? Not yet. He pointed toward another shipping schedule. They're leaving tomorrow morning. Tomorrow, graduation day. The manager continued. There's still time. What do you need? Proof that the appraisal supporting the collateral no longer represents uncontested ownership. I handed him the museum verification, then the repair records, then photographs showing Tyler beside the medals throughout his childhood. Finally, I placed one last document on the desk. My handwritten estate letter. It had been prepared years earlier, but never officially filed. The final sentence read, "All military medals and service citations are intended for my grandson, Tyler Lawson, upon my passing." The manager read it twice. "This changes the review." "How?" "It establishes long-standing family intent." He carefully returned every page. "I'll suspend tomorrow's outbound shipment until legal ownership verification is completed." The medals wouldn't leave. Not yet. Driving home, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't racing to recover pieces of bronze and ribbon anymore. I was protecting the promise Tyler believed I had already made. That evening, David waited beside my garage. "I know you've figured it out." "I have." He looked exhausted. "I never wanted Tyler to know." "Neither do I." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then David quietly whispered, "I don't care what happens to me tomorrow." He lowered his eyes. "I just don't want my son believing his parents sold his grandfather's honor." The hardest conversation still waited. But for the first time since Tyler found the pawnshop listing, the medals themselves would still be waiting when morning came. Graduation morning arrived beneath a clear blue sky. While families gathered at the high school auditorium carrying flowers, cameras, and balloons, I drove in the opposite direction, with a weathered binder resting on the passenger seat beside me. During my years in the National Guard, ceremonies always came after inspections. You honored the work only after you proved everything that mattered was secure. Today would be no different. The liquidation warehouse manager met me at the loading dock before opening hours. "I've reviewed your ownership file again." I placed one final document onto his desk. It was the original museum verification containing my signature, serial numbers, and photographs taken years before anyone imagined the medals would ever become collateral. Beside it lay the estate letter naming Tyler as the intended heir. The manager compared every page carefully. Then he nodded. "I've spoken with our legal department, and the collateral process relied upon ownership representations that are now under formal dispute." He slid a release form across the desk. "Pending resolution, the shipment remains permanently suspended." A warehouse employee disappeared through a steel security door. Several minutes later, he returned carrying a padded storage case. I recognized it instantly. The same olive green presentation case I had packed away years earlier. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Every medal, every ribbon, every citation, exactly where they belonged. I ran one finger gently across the bronze achievement medal. The tiny scratch near the ribbon mount still caught the light exactly as it had decades earlier. Nothing had been polished away, nothing had been replaced. The medals had survived. Now the harder part remained. When I arrived home, David and Melissa were already waiting inside my workshop. Neither spoke first. I placed the storage case on the workbench between us. Melissa covered her mouth the moment she saw it. "You got them back." "I did." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm so sorry." David stared at the floor. "I signed the extension request." "I know. I thought if I bought another month, you'd save the business." He nodded silently. Melissa finally spoke. The loan officer said the metals would never leave the warehouse if I repaid everything quickly. Her voice broke. I believed him. I looked at both of them for a long moment. Then I quietly opened the binder. One by one, I laid every document across the bench. The appraisal, the shipping authorization, the loan file, the extension request, the ownership verification, the repair receipt. No accusations, no raised voices, only the complete story. Melissa wiped away her tears. I never meant to sell your service. I know. I was trying to save our family. You almost lost it instead. No one argued, because the documents no longer allowed anyone to hide behind intentions alone. David finally looked up. We'll repay every dollar. I believe you will. I'll also tell Tyler. I shook my head. Not today. Both of them looked surprised. He graduates once. He doesn't need to carry our failures across that stage. Melissa began crying openly. I don't deserve that kindness. This isn't about deserving. It's about Tyler. An hour later, we sat together in the auditorium watching Tyler receive his diploma. He searched the crowd until he found us. Me, his father, his mother, all smiling. After the ceremony, he ran toward me. Grandpa! I reached into the presentation case I had quietly carried beneath my seat. The bronze achievement medal rested inside. I promised I'd tell you the stories. His eyes widened. You found them. I did. He carefully held the medal with both hands. I'll take good care of these. I smiled. I know. At that moment, I realized my greatest inheritance had never been bronze ribbon or military recognition. It was giving my grandson one more reason to believe that truth, when faced with patience and courage, could repair even the deepest family wounds without destroying the people worth protecting. 3 months after Tyler's graduation, the walnut cabinet stood exactly where it always had in the corner of my workshop. This time, however, the medals rested inside for a different reason. They were no longer waiting to be inherited someday. They had already become part of a promise shared between 2 generations. Every Saturday morning, Tyler still arrived before sunrise. The old pickup we rebuilt together now sat beside another restoration project, waiting patiently for its turn. Some traditions survive because people protect them. Others survive because people choose to rebuild them after they have nearly been lost. David and Melissa had begun doing the same. They sold what remained of the failed business, repaid every outstanding obligation connected to the loan, and met with a financial counselor before making another major decision. None of those changes erased what had happened, but they ensured desperation would never again be allowed to make decisions that honesty should have made first. One afternoon, Melissa walked quietly into my workshop, carrying a small wooden box. I made something. Inside rested a brass plate engraved with a single sentence. Our family's greatest inheritance is integrity. She looked at me nervously. I know I'll spend years earning back trust. I nodded. Trust grows the same way an old truck gets restored. One careful repair at a time. She smiled through tears. I can do that. I believe you can. Later that week, Tyler asked if we could finally talk about the medals. Not how they disappeared, but why they mattered. So I placed each medal across the workbench one by one. I told him about freezing winter nights repairing National Guard vehicles so rescue convoys could keep moving. I told him about teammates whose names never appeared in newspapers. I told him that every ribbon represented ordinary people doing ordinary work faithfully until extraordinary moments arrived. When I finished, Tyler looked at the Bronze Achievement Medal for a long time. I used to think these proved you were brave. What do you think now? I think they remind people you kept showing up. I smiled. That's a much better answer. Before closing the cabinet, I placed one more envelope beside the medals. It contained the museum ownership records, the family photograph, and a handwritten letter. Not about military history, about character. The final sentence read, "If these medals ever become valuable, remember that their greatest worth was never measured in money. It was measured in the people we refused to sacrifice to protect them." Years from now, Tyler would inherit both the medals and the letter. I hoped he would treasure the second even more than the first. As the afternoon sunlight filled the workshop, I realized the investigation had never truly been about recovering pieces of bronze. It had been about rescuing something far more fragile. A young man's belief that honor cannot be sold, trust can be rebuilt, and the strongest families are not the ones that never fail, but the ones courageous enough to face the truth together. If this story reminded you that the greatest legacy we leave behind is our character, carry that lesson into your own family. Tell the stories behind your treasured possessions while you still can. Choose honesty before desperation. And remember that forgiveness does not erase accountability. It gives accountability the chance to heal instead of destroy. God bless you, your family, and every veteran whose finest legacy is found not in medals displayed on a shelf, but in the values quietly passed from one generation to the next.